Hey everyone, this is Chris from Codecademy, and in this video we're going to be going over the Film Finder project from the Learn JavaScript course. To complete this project, you'll need to be familiar with APIs, HTTP requests, querying, asynchronous JavaScript, and catching exceptions. Let's get started. In this project, we're going to be using an external API to send some data to our Film Finder web application. So the purpose of our Film Finder web app is to allow us to select a genre, and then it's going to use data from the movie database and randomly select a movie from that genre for us to watch. And it's going to display some information about it. So in order to access the movie database API, we need to create an account on their site. So on the left in the instructions here, there's a link to create an account. And once we select that link, it's going to send us to a page like this where we can enter in username, password, and email. Once we confirm the link in our email, it will send us to a page like this, which has our profile information. Now, in order to get an API key, we can select the icon at the top right for profile and settings, and then select settings. This is going to open up a new page. And on the left, there's going to be a link called API. So we can click that. And here it's going to have a link to request the API key. And it's going to ask some questions about why it's being used and where it's being used. But once that's filled out, it's going to provide us with an API key. Now, an API key is used to authenticate which users and which applications are allowed to use the API. So it's important that this is kept private so that no one else can pretend to be us using it elsewhere. So right now we're going to copy this key and we're going to go back to our application. And for the first task, in this first group of tasks, we're going to be basically setting up our keys here in our URL, and then we're going to be getting the get genre function working so we can populate this drop down in our Film Finder web app. So for task 1, we're going to store the key that we just received into the TMDB key constant. So I'm going to paste that here. Make this larger. And that's the end of task number 1. So for task 2, we're going to check the TMDB documentation to find the base URL. We're going to save it in the TMDB base URL variable here. So if we go back to this page, we have an example request. We can copy it from here. If we select this first part, we can paste it in as the string. We can double check with this link. It's going to open up the documentation for us. And at the top left of the screen, you can see api.themoviedb.org/3 for version 3 of the API. And that matches with what we have here. So next we're going to be working inside of the get genres function, and that's going to retrieve an array of genres so we can populate that drop down in our web application. So to start, we need to create a variable called the genre request endpoint, and that's going to hold the string representing the endpoint for our API. So we can click the link for the TMDB documentation again. This link's going to send us to the genre page. And here, the /genre/movie/list is the endpoint that we need. So we're going to copy that. Back in our program, we're going to create a constant called genre request endpoint. Set it equal to the string of that endpoint location. Okay, now for step 4, we are going to create some query parameters. In this case, we're just going to use API key is set equal to the value of our TMDB key, which we received earlier. So we're going to say const, and then request params. It's going to be equal. In this case, we're going to use a template string so that we can insert the value of tmdb key directly in a placeholder spot. So to do that, we can use backticks, and then our query will start with a question mark, and API underscore key is equal to, and now for a placeholder, use $sign in the curly braces, and we're going to pass the value of tmdb key. And that's the end of step 4. So for step 5, we're going to also use a template string. In this case, we're going to be connecting all of our values together here. The URL, the request endpoint, and the parameters to create our entire URL. So this can be another constant. We're going to call it URL to fetch. That's equal to the template string with 3 placeholders back to back to back. It's going to be the tmdb URL, the tmdb base URL, sorry. Followed by the genre request endpoint. And finally, the request params. Okay, now we're going to move on to step 6. So for step 6, we're going to turn getGenres into an asynchronous function that returns a promise. So to do that, all we need to do is use the async keyword up here where the function is created. Just like so. So this is going to cause the function to return a promise, where a promise is just an object that's going to contain the result of some executed code eventually. In this case, that code is going to be a call to the API. So for step 7, we need to add a try-catch statement. And this is because sometimes the request could fail, or there could be some sort of error when making the API call. So we need to be able to handle that without our program crashing. So we're going to have try and catch. And we're just going to call the exception error. And in the catch block, we need to log our caught error to the console. So here we're going to do console.log and pass in our error. So next, in step 8, we're going to actually make that call to the API now using the fetch function. And we can store the response in the value, or a constant called response. So we're going to say const response is equal to, and then we use the await keyword. This pauses our function until the promise resolves. And then we're going to use fetch, which is a function call which returns a promise. And we're going to pass the URL to fetch. So this is going to wait for a promise to resolve and then store the result into our constant called response. So now for step 9, inside of our try block, we're going to check that the response was successful by seeing if it evaluates to a truthy value. And in JavaScript, a truthy value is any value that's positive or a non-null object or anything that's not empty. Because a false value would be something like 0 or an empty object. But in this case, we can use the .ok property of the response object, and it will return a truthy value for us. It will retrieve that value, and we can check in a conditional statement. So if response.ok OK. So if it resolves to some truthy value, then we're going to do some sort of action. But that's going to be in the next step. So now step 10, inside this if statement, we're going to capture the data that we need and populate it to our drop-down menu. So we're going to convert the response that we got into a JSON object so it's easy to work with. So we're going to create a const and JSON response. It's equal to, this also uses a promise, so we're going to await, and then JSON response, response.json. Okay. Now this is going to convert the response object that we received, and it's going to store it in a constant called JSON response. So now for step 11, let's make sure that the code is working. We can log the response to the console. And in the console, we should see an object with a single key called genres. So in order to view the console, since right now in our learning environment, we have our web app, then our code and instructions. To see the console, you can either right-click and inspect, which will open it, or you can use the F12 key, or you can go through the settings and you can enable this window here. In this case, I'm using Chrome, and I have it filtered to show info only. You want to click on the console tab, and now if we add in console.log JSON response and hit save, it's going to automatically run it for us. And we can see in the console there was an array of genres populated here. So it was successful. So let's exit out of the console and open this back up. And I'm going to remove the log here. And now, since we know it's successful, we can store the genres property into a constant. And say const genres is equal to JSON response dot genres. Now for step 12, we're going to return these values. This is going to be sent into our web application. And let me open this up, and I'm going to save it. And now on the right side of the screen in the Film Finder web app, we can now select one of these genres from our dropdown. So now we can pull that genre data from the API, and we're going to actually pass the genre that we select into our next function, and we're going to get all the movies from a certain genre. So right now we're going to modify the get movies function. And in step 13, we're going to begin by getting the API endpoint for movie discovery. So let me open this up. And here we can click the link just like we did last time. This is going to show us the endpoint we need. So we can go ahead and copy that. And we have our getSelectedGenre function call, which is a helper function from the code over here in helpers.js. and it's going to extract that genre that's in our dropdown that we've selected and store it in selected genre. So here we're going to create a new constant. So const discover movie endpoint. We're going to set it equal to the string that we copied. And now, just like in the last function, we're going to create a request params. We're going to use a template string, but it's going to be slightly different this time. We're going to have our question mark, and API key is equal to placeholder, then TMDB key. But we're also going to add another parameter. So we're going to have ampersand, then width underscore genre, and then equals our selected genre that we have. Okay. So it's basically similar to the last request params, but now we have two parameters here. We have the API key and the width genre. And also in step 14, we're going to be just putting them together. So this combines two steps here. Const and then URL to fetch. And use a template string. We're going to stick all three variables together with three placeholders. TMDB base URL. Then discover movie endpoint. Then after that, the request params. Okay. So now for step 15, we're going to turn get movies into an asynchronous function. So just like last time, we're going to add the async keyword. And also, we're going to create our try-catch block, just like last time. So we're going to have try, catch, we can call it error. And if there was an error, we're going to log it to the console. Otherwise, if it was successful, we're going to have our call to the API here. So we're going to store it in response. Const response is equal to, we'll wait for our promise to resolve. And this is going to use the fetch function. We're going to pass in our URL to fetch. It's going to look very similar to our last function, except we're just passing in our selected genre up here as a parameter. Okay, so for step 16, we're going to now check if the response was successful, if it resolves to a truthy value. This is going to be very similar to what we did last time. If response.ok. Then now we're going to convert it to JSON response, and then we're going to check the console and see what happened. So we say const JSON response equals wait, then response.json. So let's see what happened. In order to check, we can log it to the console. console.log JSON response. And now we can call this function outside of the declaration, somewhere down here. Say get movies. And save it, which will run it as well. We open our console back up. You can see we have an object which has some data here, and the key called results holds all of our movie info. So we know it's working properly. So I'm going to remove this function call and remove the console.log. That's the end of step 16. And for 17, we're now going to store that results property into a variable called movies. And we're also going to be returning that value. So here you can say fonts and then movies is equal to JSON response dot result. Okay. And now we can log it again just to check that our movies are showing up properly. Then we can call down here, say get movies, just to double check that everything's working fine. Open up the console. You can see we have our array of movie data. Okay, so let's remove that function call and the log, and let's keep moving on. Also at the end we need to return movies. We're done with that task. So at this point we have a function which retrieves the genres, and another function which retrieves a list of all the movies which match the genre that we picked from the dropdown. So all we need to do now is randomly pick one of the movies and display its info in our web app. So next we're going to create the function which retrieves movie info based on the random or one of the movies that's selected. So we're going to be working inside of the getMoviesInfo function, and we're going to have it actually accept a parameter. So we're going to pass in a movie into this function, and then it's going to retrieve the data about that movie from the API, and then we'll display it later on in the show random movie. So now we're going to accept a parameter called movie. And then here we're going to have a constant called movie ID. Then ID is equal to the ID property of this movie that we pass in. Okay, so this is the property that we're going to use to pass to the API, which will identify which movie it is and then send us that information about it. So now for 19, we're going to go back, check the documentation, and see which endpoint we need to retrieve movie details. So we can click on this. It's going to show /movie/ and then whatever movie ID we're passing in. So let's copy this, go back to our program. Now we can say const and movie endpoint. It's equal to a template string where we have our values here, except now for movie ID we're going to have a placeholder, and we're going to call it movie ID because that's the variable that we used up here. That's basically just going to pull whatever ID that we get from value that's passed into this function. So now for task number 20. So like the other functions, we're going to create some query parameters, some request parameters here. So I'm going to do const request params. It's equal to, in this case, we just need our template string with our API key. It's equal to placeholder and the TMDB key. And then in this step, we're also going to set up that URL constant as well, which, just like the other functions, we're going to piece together each of those variables. Do TMDB base URL. And then we're going to do the movie endpoint. And finally, we have our request params. That's the end of step 20. In 21, we're also going to convert this into an asynchronous function, adding async, and then the try-catch block as well, because there's a possibility that our request could fail. We're going to catch our exception, call it error, and log the error if it occurs. And now in our try block, we're going to use our fetch and await the response and store it into a constant called response. Let's go ahead and do that. So const response is equal to await, which waits for a promise to resolve, and fetch, which creates that promise, and URL to fetch, which is the URL of the API that we're interacting with. And we're done with step 21. Now, step 22 is going to look similar to the other functions as well. We're just going to check if that response was okay, and if so, we're going to be converting it to JSON so it's easy to work with. We're going to say response.ok. We're going to do const JSON response is equal to await, then our JSON response is await, then response.json. So that converts into the JSON form. And then now our movie info is going to be the entire JSON object. So our const movie info is equal to JSON response. That's the end of step 22. And now at the end, we're going to return this info in the last line of the if block. So return movie info. Okay. So now we can retrieve information about the chosen movie, and it's going to be used in the next function to randomly select the movie and display its info. So now we're going to be working with the display movie or show random movie function, and it's going to be displaying the information based on which movie was randomly selected from the array of movies that we retrieved based on the genre that we provided in that dropdown. So we're going to start here on task 24, and what we're going to do is we're going to start by turning it into an asynchronous function, and we're going to await the return from get movies. We're going to save that result into movies. So there's a few things we're going to do here. So we're going to go down and in show random movies, we have our get element by ID function, which retrieves movie info and stores that. And then if the node length is greater than 0, we're going to clear a current movie. And after this occurs, we're going to call get movies. So if there was some result already there, we're going to clear that. And then now we're going to retrieve our information using the functions we defined earlier in the code. And we're going to piece everything together to make our application work. So let's turn this into an asynchronous function with async, because we're going to be waiting on some promises to resolve, because we know our other functions include promises. So the first step would be storing the movies. So const movies is equal to await, then get movies. So this is going back and calling our get movies function, which then uses whatever selected genre we have and returns that big list of movies, big array of movies. And now we need to pick one of those movies. So we're going to move on to step 25. And we have a helper function called getRandomMovie. So we can pass in our array. So const randomMovie is equal to getRandomMovies. And we're going to pass in the array that we retrieved from our getMovies function here. And this is going to select one for us. And now we need to obtain that information, the detailed info about the movie that was selected. So we're going to go to step 26. And we're going to create another const called info, which is going to store that information. We're going to await for the promise to resolve, because we're going to call the API again using our getMovieInfo function. And now we're going to pass in randomMovie. And then it's end of 26. And the very last line of this function, we're going to call another helper function called displayMovie. And we're passing in the info that we retrieved from the API call. And there we have it. So let's save it and run our program. Mess with the web application and see what we get. So we can pick a genre here. Let's say action, and then click Let's Play. Let's see what the issue is. Console, errors, get random movies, not defined. Okay, so that is something that's included. So we can make use of our error catching here. There we go. This is going to randomly select a movie for us. In this case, action movie. Pick this one, and we have some info. So let me open this up. Some info about the movie, and then there's an upvote and a downvote there. Okay. And let's go ahead and try it with something else. Fantasy. We have a different result. And we can go through and play around with our web app and see what movies it selects for us. Let's shrink this down. And now if you want some additional challenges, you can modify some of these helper functions here such as display movie, and you can rearrange the layout to show more information such as the cast or release date. And you could also store the user's liked and disliked movies, because we do have an up and down vote here. You could also return a randomized page, including a randomized movie, because right now it only picks a random movie from the very first page of the results. Great job completing this project! We've learned how to interact with a real API and incorporate it into our own web application. Make sure to take another look at the order of our function calls to see how the data is passed between them and used in additional calls to the TMDP API. If you have any questions, be sure to post a message on the Codecademy forum. Thanks for watching!